So welcome to another video from Hawks' History. We're going to continue today to focus on the depth study on paper 1, which again is conflict and tension between East and West between 1945 to 1972, and again this is a section on the Cold War. Okay, so this video focuses on quite a lot actually. It's the contrasting attitudes and the ideologies of the USA and USSR, which includes the aims of Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, Attlee and Truman. And we're also going to look at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, because you need to understand both bits, understand them all fully. Okay, like last time, there's a key question to consider for the whole section, and this is, why did the Allies become enemies? We started to look at this in the last video, but we are going to spend more time looking at this over the next few videos in this section. So the contrasting attitudes and ideologies of the USA and USSR are as follows. The USA was a capitalist state. They believed in making the most money for each company. Individual rights and freedom of the people are really important. And again, its main focus here is on making as much money as you can. Nothing is state-owned. It's all sort of down to you, and your individual rights and freedoms are crucial. Communism is where the businesses and things like that are state-owned. They're owned by the state. The government own your business, so you don't own anything really in communist states. The individual rights and freedoms of the people are much less important. Now, the USSR was a good example of this, and a nice reminder is the hammer and sickle sign seen on their flag. Democracy was fundamentally elections. It's where you vote for who you want in power. In the UK, we have a general election every 5 years. In the USA, they have a presidential election every 4 years. So both countries are democracies. And the USA was a capitalist democracy. So if you think about democracy, sort of voting in the exam, if you get a question on that, that might be a nice thing to sort of remind you of what that keyword is. And finally, a dictatorship. This is a one-party state. The USSR was a communist dictatorship. They only allowed the Communist Party. And a nice picture to remind you of Stalin when you think about dictatorships of the USSR. Nazi Germany was a dictatorship. It only allowed the Nazi Party. So then you can see similarities between the USSR and Nazi Germany in the way they sort of ran their countries. So what were the aims of Stalin at the Yalta Conference? We're going to look at each of the leaders in turn, but Stalin's the most different and the most obvious to sort of pinpoint exactly what he wanted, as he laid them out really clearly at the conference. Now he wanted to gain more land, because in the Second World War he had lost 27 million Soviet soldiers, and therefore Stalin felt he should get the most out of the post-war settlement, with this being land, and also sort of the most power and the most. He felt quite confident going to the conference because of the position he was in. He wanted a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe to act as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany. Because remember, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union twice in the past, once in the First World War and again in the Second World War, and therefore this buffer zone would hopefully prevent Germany invading again. So at this point he just really wants influence in these countries. Later it emerges that actually he wants control, but the other Western leaders don't realise he wants control. They just think he wants influence. They're happy to accept his influence, but they don't obviously want the control that emerges later on. Now he also wants heavy reparations from Germany, and like I said, Russia had been invaded twice by Germany, so the heavy reparations would enable a weak Germany, and this would, along with the buffer zone, hopefully prevent Germany invading and threatening the Soviet Union again. Now the aims of Roosevelt at Yalta were much more different to Stalin, because he, like Churchill, was focused on democracy, freedom of speech, but he did realise that it was essential to make a deal with Stalin. The war in the Pacific, which as we looked at last time was the war with Japan, was still going on, because remember this was before the atomic bomb. The Soviets also had a very strong position in Europe, so by the end of the war, the Soviets were beginning to go into Eastern Europe and liberate it from Nazi control. So their army was actually increasing its presence in Eastern Europe. So he had a very strong presence, the Soviet Union, in Europe, and to help balance it out, Roosevelt felt it was essential to make a deal with Stalin. He wanted free and fair elections in Europe. Fundamentally, this was one of his key aims, but he felt that by what they were fighting for in the war, democracy was a key element of Roosevelt's policy. He also wanted the UN to be ratified, which was the United Nations, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later on. And he wanted an end to empires. So this was a possible threat to Churchill, although the USA and the UK got on very well. Roosevelt disliked empire, which is what Churchill actually wanted to uphold. So therefore there can be a a slight clash between these two people at Yalta. Okay, so what were the aims of Churchill at Yalta? Now, fundamentally, it was to protect Poland. Poland had been the main reason why Britain had gone to war at all, because of the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. So Britain really wanted to safeguard the future of Poland. He wanted, again, free and fair elections. He wanted to be democratic. He didn't want Stalin to be overly influential in Poland. He also wanted to protect Britain's empire, and in like reason, he wanted free and fair elections in Europe. So what was the percentages agreement? It's something you don't need to know in extreme detail for GCSE, but you do need to understand its role, impact on the conferences later on. So in 1944 there was the Moscow Conference, and at this conference this agreement was drawn up, and Churchill and Stalin agreed who would have what percentage of influence in European countries. Roosevelt was not this. Only 2 out of the 3 members of the Big Three were able to go. It was a percentage of influence, as you can see by the picture in the top right hand corner. Yugoslavia 50-50, Hungary 50-50, but Bulgaria and Romania was 75% Soviet, 25% British and American. Therefore, this, as it was percentage of influence, it shows each side had some degree of interest, as reflected by the percentages at the top right-hand corner. This shows Churchill did not want Stalin to control Eastern Europe. He was not allowing Stalin to dominate Europe. He was happy to accept Stalin having a large influence in the West. Churchill and Roosevelt demonstrate their desire for some element of interest and percentage of influence in these countries by calling for free and fair elections in Europe at Yalta. This percentages agreement was not a binding deal. There was no signing or signature. Stalin just ticked it to show he approved, even though he in reality didn't, as he chose to accept what he wanted. So he allowed Britain large influence in Greece, but took complete control over Eastern Europe. He did not follow Churchill's advice to have some influence for the Soviets, some influence for British and American. He took complete control over Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and so on. So we can see that perhaps this agreement was important, but it has very little relevance to later on because it never was actually kept to by Stalin. But it's important to know because with the Truman Doctrine, it was largely launched because Stalin allowed Americans and British to have large influence in Greece. So this is important for later on to know and understand. So why did tensions break down at Yalta? So the USSR were already advancing on Eastern Europe. For example, Warsaw was liberated in January, and remember Warsaw is in Poland. Therefore, this meant that at Yalta, which was from the 4th to the 12th of February, Stalin's position is therefore much stronger than the other members of the Big Three because of the power of his army in Eastern Europe. As a result of this, the Big Three agree that Stalin could have a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, as the Red Army was in Eastern Europe. Therefore, in reality, there was much that the West could do to make Stalin leave. But it doesn't mean that they didn't want democracy. They didn't want Stalin to control Eastern Europe. They just wanted him to have friendly states. For example, they matched the percentage agreement. They still had an interest in those countries. And the Declaration of Liberated Europe shows that they were still interested, but they were happy to allow Stalin to have most of the influence in those countries, but not to control them. But Stalin, however, wanted to control them, therefore would ignore what the other allies said. So what were the outcomes of the Yalta Conference? First of all, Germany was split into 4 zones: British, French, American and Soviet. The same division was for Berlin. You can see here on the map, British, French, American and Soviet. As the Soviet was the main part of the eastern side of Germany, and therefore a large part of Eastern Europe. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was the free and fair elections for Eastern Europe. This is what they wanted Stalin to follow and accept and allow in the countries he was having large influence over. However, Stalin never really follows this. He was just going along to keep the West happy, keep them as an ally. But by Potsdam it's clear he was not allowing free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. The UN was to be ratified. We'll look at this in a later video in more detail. But it was a massive organisation of countries that were agreeing on peace and security in the world. And this was quite a nice thing that Roosevelt wanted, and Stalin was happy to allow this again to keep the West as allies. And the USSR was to help the USA in the war with Japan. Remember, the Yalta Conference was before the atomic bomb, and therefore there was a need for the USSR's support at this point, but by Potsdam this was no longer needed with the atomic bomb and its power. So quite civil, quite cordial agreements at Yalta. They seem to be more of a compromise than a massive success. No one's really got what they overall wanted. Stalin's got quite a lot of his desires, but it's quite obvious that he was not allowed complete control. He was accepted as a sphere of influence, but this would develop as time goes on, and basically the West would have very little to prevent Stalin gaining more control. But we can definitely say Yalta and its outcomes highlight that Yalta was a compromise, and quite a positive compromise as well. It kept the big three together, but there were beginning to emerge cracks in their relationship. So Potsdam was the second conference in 1945, and it took place after Yalta. The main objective of this conference was to finalise a post-war settlement and put into action all the agreements from Yalta. Now, unfortunately, the war in Europe finished on the 8th of May, 1945. The Potsdam Conference started on the 17th of July, 1945. Therefore, it took place after victory in Europe. More concrete decisions can be made than at Yalta. For example, over Germany, reparations, the post-war sort of government, all that sort of thing, was agreed more at Potsdam. We're going to look at why did Potsdam go so wrong. It has a reputation, Potsdam, for being the problem conference, the one that didn't really agree anything. But there were some agreements, but overall this one really began to sort of show the cracks between the big three. And arguably this conference, more so than Yalta, is perhaps only the start of the Cold War, but these two conferences really do initiate Cold War tensions. So why did Potsdam go so wrong? The first answer is perhaps people. So Roosevelt had died and was now replaced by Truman as President of the United States. He was very anti-Stalin, so when he arrived at the Potsdam Conference, he was quite a big clash in personality with Stalin. These two did not get on very well at all. Now, partway through the conference, Churchill lost the general election to Clement Attlee. Therefore, he was replaced by Attlee partway through the conference. So therefore, Stalin was the only member who had attended Yalta of the big three at Potsdam. So we can see a change from the original big three of Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill to the new big three of Stalin, Truman and Attlee. So why else did Potsdam go so wrong? A second answer to this question could be Europe. Now remember, Stalin had not allowed any free and fair elections of the countries in Eastern Europe that he had his army in, from Yalta to Potsdam, so the sphere of influence he had, he wasn't adhering to that policy of free and fair elections. And remember, the West still had an interest in them. They wanted there to be democracy, but Stalin wasn't allowing that, which would have annoyed the West and caused tensions to rise. There were also arguments over where the boundaries should be drawn, especially to do with Poland and Germany. These had been started at Yalta, and trying to finalise at Potsdam was much more complicated than they had thought it would be. So why did Potsdam go so badly wrong? We can look at perhaps the reparations, as remember there were arguments over how much reparations the Soviets could take from Germany. The West were worried, however, that taking too much in reparations would repeat the problems caused by the Treaty of Versailles. Now remember, the Soviets wanted a weak Germany and to continue to view it as a potential future threat again. So making it weak with taking lots of money away from them, they would prevent them becoming a future threat. However, the West wanted to view them as an ally. They wanted to build them up so they could be friendly to the West and perhaps again and to sort of prevent Soviet power increasing further into Germany. So to recap, what was the Treaty of Versailles? Remember, it agreed the peace after World War I, and it was to make Germany take the full blame of World War I. You can see from the cartoon at the bottom. They were given crippling payments to make for the cost of the war, such as to pay £6.6 billion by 1922. This eventually led to the rise of Hitler. So why did Potsdam go so badly wrong? A final answer could perhaps be the bomb. It was tested, remember, the day before Potsdam, and Stalin feared it would destroy the balance between the two superpowers. At this point, it was only America that was now nuclear. The Soviet Union, remember, was only nuclear from 1949. Spying had been going on from the Soviets and the US, working on what was going on, so again, it was a lack of trust, and this marked a shift in how the Allies were becoming enemies. So to re-watch the video 1 would be a good recap for the bomb and the superpower relations. Okay, so what were some of the key outcomes from Potsdam? So one key one was that Germany would be demilitarised and the denazification, which was the re-education of the German people, would take place. Nazis would be put on trial, and this would become the Nuremberg trials. And the USSR would receive reparation from its own zone, plus an additional 25% from the western zones in Germany. So what were some of the key changes from Yalta to Potsdam? So the Soviet military was now in the majority of Eastern Europe. Remember, Yalta it was in some of Eastern Europe, but by Potsdam it was in the majority of it. The Allies cannot stop Stalin during the once now, because even if he doesn't hold free and fair elections, which is what they agreed at Yalta, they can't get in there to stop him doing it because he's got his army there. It would be a declaration of war if they were to invade. So remember, Truman and Attlee replaced Roosevelt and Churchill, which was a further change of the big three from Yalta to Potsdam. And the day before Potsdam, the atomic bomb had been successfully tested by the USA, and it changed the balance of power. So what we can see here is the Soviets were really powerful at Yalta. They were already going into Eastern Europe. Their sphere of influence was becoming stronger and more of a reality, which was why the Allies had no other option but to sort of grant it to Stalin. They couldn't stop him doing it, really. But by Potsdam, the USA had a much stronger position because of the atomic bomb. So we can see some shifts in balance and power between the USA and the USSR by Potsdam. So how important were Yalta and Potsdam in increasing superpower relations? Now, as this is a conflict and tension between East and West depth study paper, you must always have in the back of your mind how each factor increased or decreased tension and conflict between the superpowers. So it highlighted the reality of Stalin's desire to control Eastern Europe. He didn't hold any free and fair elections as he had promised. There were disagreements over Germany, and these disagreements were a source of continuing conflict throughout the Cold War, such as the Berlin blockade, the building of the Berlin Wall, for example. It also started the divisions between the superpowers. Some historians do argue that these conflicts see the start of the Cold War. So, talk about divisions, we definitely can see these emerging because you've got the East sort of having an emerging sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, the West wanting this not to happen, this sort of Red Army going into Eastern Europe, sort of the desire for democracy in Eastern Europe, Stalin's sort of non-commitment to this. There are divisions and conflicts between the two all the time, and these do emerge from Yalta and Potsdam. And it's important to remember that Stalin and Truman did not get on at all. This would continue the Truman Doctrine in response to Stalin's aggressive, as he called it, expansion into Eastern Europe. And these would be a continuing sort of problem for these two whilst they were in power. And perhaps we can see the root of these conflicts from the Potsdam Conference, where they first met. So we're going to go back to that specimen question from the AQA paper, which was the main reason for the development of the Cold War in the years 1945 to 1949, also Truman Doctrine. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. And this will be 16 marks. So remember this sort of question, as it's a statement, and then how far do you agree? You need to look at for, you need to look at against, and you need to come to a substantiated conclusion which gives your point of view in response to the question. Now, it's important with this question as well to think about important factors, not just factors that could link to the question. You need to pick the most important factors for and the most important factors against, because you just don't have enough time to write about absolutely everything. So this last time we looked at the bomb as some possible factors against. We're going to look now at against factors again, but these regarding the Potsdam and Yalta conferences. So remember, Stalin does not keep his word. There were no elections in Eastern Europe, seeming to have taken place by Potsdam, which is one source of conflict. And again, you might say the development of the Cold War was perhaps the increase in tension. So this would definitely show an increase in tension. Truman and Stalin clash, and it includes atomic bomb. And Germany is divided at Yalta, which sets up future problems, perhaps including the Berlin blockade. And this is perhaps a more long-term cause. If you wanted to be really sort of smart in your answer, you would talk about how this was a development of the Cold War in the longer term, because it sets up some of the future problems. So you'd have to talk about this with regards to future problems, such as the Berlin blockade, which is also, when we come to study, in this time from 45 to 49. So that would be okay to talk about. And remember, as I said last time, it's really important to get the top marks of this question. You must learn the dates of the years events happened. This will make your answer secure and confident. If you talk about an event that happened after the time, they won't mark you down, but they just won't mark it at all. Which means, therefore, that you will waste time in the exam writing about irrelevant information. So make sure you don't have to learn like the 17th of July or the 8th of May, for example. You just need to know in 1945 this happens, and also to sort of know what happened in which order. So if you're talking about Yalta and Potsdam, the exam board will expect you to know that Yalta came first and then Potsdam came afterwards. Okay, so how do you achieve the top band in the mark scheme for this specific question? And the exam board state you need a complex explanation of stated factor and other factors leading to a sustained judgment, and answers demonstrate a range of accurate and detailed knowledge and understanding that is relevant to the question. So basically, what you need to do is explain the specific factor with specific evidence, explaining how it answers the question specifically, and then using all that information for and all the information against to come to a conclusion based on what you think the answer is. Thanks for watching today, guys. I hope you found today's video useful. I hope you come back and watch some more soon. Thanks, bye.